Welcome everyone to Women in the Military podcast. I'm really excited to have John here. I got a chance to read his book Kurtz before we did this interview, obviously, and I loved the book. It was so good. I couldn't put it down. I actually read it right after I read um now I'm blanking. The Woman by Kristen Hanna, and then I read your book right after it, and they were like so different but so focused on women, and it was just really fascinating. And I read both of those books in less than a week. So it was really good. So I'm really excited to have you here, and I'm excited to share your book with my audience.
I'm glad to be here.
So let's get to know a little bit about you because you are a veteran. So we always start with why did you decide to join the military? So can you tell us a little about your story?
Yeah, so it's kind of an odd story. I wanted to be a Marine ever since I was a teenager. And for a long time, it looked like I wouldn't be able to do it. I failed the physical a couple of times in college, failed a couple of times in my 20s, failed a couple of times in my 30s. It almost got to a point where I didn't ever think I would pass. It's just like buying lottery tickets. I actually did finally pass the physical, ended up graduating boot camp at age 31. So I was older than three of my four drill instructors. So that was kind of like a dream come true. It was a little odd, though. I think if I had gotten in earlier, I might have had a more normal career. But as it worked out, ended up being in the reserves because I already kind of had my life going on when I unexpectedly found myself with the opportunity to be a Marine.
But you still had that passion and drive to serve, even though, I mean, in a way, the military had said no, thank you, no, thank you, and you still tried again.
Yeah. Yeah. And it also, I was a newspaper reporter. And one of the things you learn as a newspaper reporter is how to defeat the bureaucracy. So, when you're not able to find past the physical, what you start to discover is, well, maybe if I get a physical with this doctor, I'll pass it. Or if I talk to this recruiter, I can do it. So just kept working the bureaucracy. And after about a dozen years, it panned out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good story for like people who are looking to join the military because sometimes you can feel like defeated and it's like, okay, well, I didn't pass my physical at MEPS, it's over, but that's not actually the case.
Yeah, you would get these definitive answers like you're disqualified, and then you would find out from somebody else, oh, wait, there's a waiver for this or a waiver for that. So you just have to dig in.
So you mentioned a little bit that you like are a journalist, and can you talk about your career and what you've done leading up to becoming an author?
Yeah, so it's sort of an odd trajectory. I always liked writing. So when I couldn't be a Marine, I became a newspaper reporter. But as you might notice, the newspaper industry is almost non existent these days. Back in the 90s, it was a pretty cool and legitimate way to have a job. But as the industry started to waver a little bit, I decided I'm going to have to find a different line of work. Most people, when they leave journalism, they go to law school or they go into public relations or something kind of related. But I thought, well, if I can't do the thing I wanted to do, I'll do something that's sort of its own little adventure. So I went to engineering school, and that kind of gave me the credentials I needed to become a military analyst. So just around that time when I was becoming a Marine, and that was helpful because that gave me a secret clearance, which helps you get jobs as a military analyst. I sort of had a new career coming together, which I've enjoyed a lot. It's been pretty cool. So I'm lucky that even though things didn't necessarily always work out the way I wanted, didn't pass that physical the first time the newspaper industry died, I still have always had jobs I thought were pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a really cool story. I feel like you would be such a great guest just to talk about your life and your military experience, but that's not what we're here for. I have to stay focused and not get sidetracked. We're here to talk about your book, which I have my copy right here. I like I said, I really loved it. I thought it was funny because I told my husband I was like, I didn't ever really want to hear what was going on inside of guys' heads, and you definitely I was like, I didn't wanna know, and it was kinda exactly what I thought, but I thought the story was just so fascinating. So can you tell us, like, why did you decide to write Kurtz?
Yeah, so it ended up being a product of frustration that I started to feel, not immediately, but sort of gradually, and it became more acute about the failures that we had in the wars on terror with all the counterinsurgency strategies that went into that. And our inability to sort of see these failures taking shape, because you really didn't have to look too hard like 10 or 12 years ago to know that things weren't looking too good. But the frustration kind of crept in because, being a Marine reservist, the way things worked out, I never was in combat. I never deployed anywhere. I never even got called up to active duty. So for a long time, the war on terror was something I cared about, but it was more like you're in the upper deck of the stadium watching on the field, but you're not a participant. But over time, the frustration just starts to get to you because, I knew a lot of people and had friends that were deploying. And there was something people kept saying that really started to bother me and nag at me. It seemed like every time somebody I knew came back from a deployment, they'd say something kind of like this: well, when we went over there, things were pretty bad, but by the end, we started to see signs of progress. And, when you keep hearing that year after year, you start thinking, there's some sort of problem here where things look good down at the micro level where you're seeing the little picture, but it doesn't add up to larger success. Because if you looked at all the big indicators, there really wasn't much sign that things were going well. I mean, you'd notice things that we never wanted, like maybe Iran getting increased influence in Iraq. Nobody wanted that. Or you would start to notice things like when we killed Osama, we couldn't tell the Pakistanis we were going to do it because our so-called ally wasn't really very trustworthy and we were afraid they might let him know. So you would start to see all these things on the macro level that made you wonder, okay, we're seeing something on the little level that maybe is encouraging, but on the macro level, it's not. And then, like I was saying earlier, in my job's a military analyst, I should probably do the disclaimer thing here. So this is a novel that I wrote. It's fiction. I made it up. It's all mine, not a reflection of any views held by any employer I had at the time I was writing it, before I was writing it, or since I was writing it. So anyway, with the disclaimer out of the way, in my job as a military analyst, you'd spend a lot of time around a lot of the people doing various types of research. And again, I would see things that would frustrate me there too. So, for example, you might see a lot of research being done on how there's a district council somewhere and maybe what elders should we put on there to fill up the district council. And it just seemed like that's a whole lot of mental energy going into something that's really teeny tiny, and I'm not sure what the impact will be. Or you'd see something like, let's look at the economic activity at some bazaar on the edge of town in some rural area of Afghanistan or something. Again, you're thinking, gee, that seems like we're putting a lot of effort into something minor. We do research on the jobs training program, and you're thinking, are these really the kind of jobs that anybody can start a new life with? And then on the rare occasion when the research wasn't focused on teeny tiny things, that kind of committed the opposite sin, which was that it would be gigantic, overly ambitious things like research on some huge topic like why do men rebel? And you're thinking that's sort of thing people have been asking for millennia. The idea that we'll pay a few contractors and get that sorted out in 9 months seems kind of silly. Or another sort of big ambitious thing that seemed like it wasn't the best use of our time is maybe there would be research into how to do a hypothetical counterinsurgency in the future involving hypothetical nations. And I'm a big believer in abstract thought and hypothetical notions and stuff like that. But when you have two real wars going on, I'm not sure how much sense it makes to be thinking about imaginary stuff. So all of that stuff made me feel like I think we're missing something. There's something I want to write about. And I wanted it to be a novel because I just sort of had this notion that when people read nonfiction, I think they have a tendency to leave the book with the same ideas that they came to the book with. And I feel like they kind of take the facts that support what they believe and they maybe sort of rebut or nitpick the facts that don't support what they believe. And you don't change a lot of people's minds. I thought maybe a novel might get more at the general reader. And because it's fiction, you're not really pointing the finger at a real person and putting them on the defensive. And I think it makes it easier for people to think about ideas. So that's how I ended up writing this book.
Yeah, I really love that it's a novel and not, I mean, I read so many nonfiction books about military life, and I really did find myself thinking a lot about the different topics and the parallels and like how it related to my circumstance. I mean, my favorite, I told you when I was reading it, was the crap money because it's so in line with my SERP money. And so it was just really funny because every time I would see it, I would think of SERP and I would just laugh because I was like, it's such a good acronym. Crap. This money is crap. But it was like, it was really relatable. And I feel like for nonfiction, it's harder to be relatable to the story because it's someone's like story, whereas there was fictional aspects. I don't know, it got me thinking a lot about like my experience and the different things, and it touched on issues that are really hard to write about in a nonfiction way because of like, classification and people's names and all these things, and so it gave you more leeway, and so I thought that was a great choice. Yeah.
Yeah, so
So
I definitely felt that way about going novel over nonfiction.
yeah. So the other thing that's really interesting about your book and probably why you're on the podcast is because the protagonist is a female Marine, or she, well, it's not, it could, the author, anyways, you know how, what I mean. The author is not a female Marine, but the guy who's writing the book, his main focus is Annie and her story. And so I thought that was really an interesting way to do it as well. So why did you decide to create that complexity?
So I had a lot of reasons for wanting the hero of the book to be a woman. So, like you said, it's narrated by a guy, a journalist, who's had a crush on the hero since they were in high school together. But it's really Annie's story. It's about her. And there were a number of reasons why it was important to me that the main character, the hero here, be a woman. So, one of the reasons is symbolic, and then the rest of them are more substantive. I'll talk about the symbolic one first. So, if you're talking about Annie is the hero of the novel, and she is, it's kind of helpful to think about, okay, well, who's the villain in this novel? And I like to think that the villain in this novel isn't a particular person or a particular group of people, but something more abstract. I think the villain in this novel is groupthink. I think it's a bunch of like minded people, maybe with similar backgrounds, going into the echo chamber, tossing around some mediocre ideas, not necessarily criticizing them that much, but because everybody's repeating it, they all kind of buy into it. And then one thing leads to another, and groupthink sort of puts the anointing oil on some ideas that aren't very good. And that's where a lot of the trouble came from. So, from a novelist point of view, trying to create a symbol, I think, okay, what is a good symbol that's the opposite of groupthink? And being a Marine and being somebody who cares a lot about the Marines, the first thing I think of when I think of the opposite of groupthink is going to be a Marine woman, and this is why. The time the novel is set, and I think this is still true, women are about 8 or 9% of the Marine Corps. So you go into a meeting, there could easily be 20 people in there, and maybe one of them's a woman. So a woman Marine, sort of the opposite of the bunch of guys who all look alike, who all had the same background, who are part of the homogenous crowd, maybe part of a good old boys network, whatever. There's going to be that one woman in that room for all the guys. And if you're thinking, okay, who's the group and who's the person who's a little bit different, you just visually immediately go, well, okay, the woman's a little bit different. And Annie has red hair too, just kind of underscore that she's just not quite like everybody else. So I just kind of wanted something that was symbolic of the opposite of groupthink. So that was kind of the symbolism there. But there were also substantive reasons. I think they're extremely relevant to the military, even though they came from experiences I had largely outside the military. One military example. So the first thing, I'll kind of go in chronological order here, is I went to Washington and Lee University. I was a freshman in 1985. That was the first year that school went co-ed. So from 1749 all the way to 1984, it was all male. And I don't care what you use to judge a school, everything about Washington and Lee got a lot better when it went co-ed. I know that there's problems with standardized tests in US News and World Report, rankings and all the rest of it. But whatever you want to use, everything was better. And the quality of the students were better, quality of the seminars, the selectivity went up. And basically, it's pretty simple. You doubled the brain pool. How could you not improve? You had this massive filter that was cutting out half the applicants. So that was sort of thing number one is you really don't want to filter out half your brain pool. Um, Another episode is, I played high school football in the early 80s in the state of Florida. And as much as I love football, that might not be the ideal cultural milieu for America today. But anyway, if you liked football back then, you were a girl, too bad. You basically had to be the equipment manager, you had to be a cheerleader. Now I coach girls flag football. And I have learned so much from listening to what these 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old girls have to say about stuff. And it's turned into real results. I mean, like we recently finished top 8 in the nation at a tournament the NFL hosted. And it's because even though I know a lot about football and I wrote a football book and I've been on the NFL network talking about football and stuff like that, you get these fresh perspectives of people who maybe their main sport was lacrosse or basketball or whatever, and they're coming here and they're talking to you about your favorite sport, but in a totally different way. I just thought, once again, when you double the brain pool, you start to learn things that you would have missed out if you'd filtered them. And then the last reason I wanted Annie to be a woman, Marine, is I had an interesting experience. Shortly after boot camp, if you're not in the infantry, the Marine Corps makes you go to the School of Infantry anyway, and you have to take a couple of week course on infantry tactics. And so at one point, we're doing this urban warfare thing, and you got to clear a house. And the instructors are giving us the instructions. They say it's one of the most difficult things you have to do here. You got to be smart, got to be alert, got to be careful. Okay, so there's 12 squads of guys. It's 144 guys. We all get killed going through there. One squad after the other, 12 dead squads. And then there's 4 squads of women. And one of those squads got through there. So, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, this is the thing where they said more than anything that you're doing here, you got to be smart, got to be careful, you got to be alert. And the only people that were smart enough, careful enough, and alert enough to get through that thing were the 12 women in that one squad that made it. So those are all the reasons, the symbolic ones and the substantive ones, why it was a really big deal to me to have Annie be the hero and be a woman and not have it reversed where Annie's the narrator, journalist, and Nick's the Marine.
Yeah, I think that would have made it lose so much of the value of the story that it tells, because it's kind of flip-flop from what the stereotype would be, and so it just gives you such a different perspective. And I think that's one of the reasons why I liked it so much, because it was so different than anything that I had ever read, and it was just so enjoyable to hear like his perspective and her perspective through her letters back. I just liked how it was done. It was really well done.
Thank you.
I'm a
That
fan,
means a lot.
can't tell. So I guess my next question is, why did you focus on the leaders in Iraq and Afghanistan? You kind of mentioned a little bit about like the groupthink, and I feel like that's one of the things that comes out clearly in the book. So, but why did you decide to pick that time?
Yeah, so I really did want to focus on leaders and just sort of remind everybody that whatever went wrong, it was some sort of problem with ideas, problems with strategy, something that comes from higher up. It wasn't because the sergeants or the first lieutenants didn't know what they were doing. And for the purposes of the novel, we were talking about why did I do novel rather than nonfiction. A novel kind of lets you handle things in a sort of more convenient, easier way. So, if I wanted to write a nonfiction thing, there'd have been a lot of stuff to explore with leadership. And you would have had to say, well, was it these generals or those generals, or was it these policy wonks, or was it those lobbyists and contractors, or was it these politicians? It would have been sort of an unwieldy thing. So I knew that I wanted to look higher up where the ideas come from. And I think I did that. But to keep it manageable for the reader so that you kind of just keep track of things, I sort of focused the emphasis on the leadership flaws in 3 people. So there was General Stanley, who kind of represents the architect of these counterinsurgency ideas that sort of keep spinning wheels in the quagmire. And then there's Colonel Jones, who sort of represents the rising star practitioner of the counterinsurgency stuff that doesn't really work so well. And then there's a guy that he doesn't have any major contributions, but I thought he represented something important, and that's Leeds Harding, the policy wonk kind of guy. Because I feel like one of the things with counterinsurgency that made everybody feel like they had a good idea when they really didn't have a good idea is that you would get the military folks who've been trained to kill people and break things coming up with ideas, and then some academic policy sort of person would kind of sprinkle the intellectual fairy dust over it to kind of give it legitimacy, like, oh, well, this must be a good idea. We got buy-in from this policy wonk over here. So that was kind of what Leeds Harding role was in that. And so again, I thought that we had a lot of ideas that just didn't really work very well. And I think Colonel Jones probably embodies that most of all, because he's the guy that would constantly parrot all the various slogans. They could have been slogans he came up with himself, or they could have been slogans he got from somebody else. And I just think, once you start having a lot of slogans, it probably means you're not thinking. And I thought that the Wars on Terror kind of had an abundance of slogans that didn't really deliver.
Oh yeah, you mean like Win the Hearts and Mind and like all the it really resonated with me as like a Afghanistan war veteran of like the disconnect between what the like really high ups were pushing out and like what we on the ground were seeing. Like we had these massive two-story schoolhouses that we were supposed to be building in these tiny villages full of mud huts and like shanties basically, and it was like this doesn't make sense. Like they aren't we would have to have electricity and they didn't have electricity. They would break generators because they put water in it because they didn't know that water and gas are different. But like those are like the disconnects of the problems that we had on the ground. And when we like tried to bring it up to higher headquarters, there was like no way to get past like our first level because they were like, no, this is great, just keep doing it. And then it just didn't work in so many different ways. And so I felt like that part really resonated with me as a veteran who had experienced it because I remember that frustration of like being so disconnected from like what was actually happening on the ground and then the stuff that we were pushing out.
Yeah, and then it's good to hear that because, like I said, I see Annie as a hero, and but at the same time, when you're reading the book, Annie's complaining a lot, and I think that she's justified in complaining. I think that she's an admirable character, but like you said, there was a lot to complain about, and I think it became frustrating because a lot of times valid complaints were disregarded because it kind of made it sobered everybody up when they wanted to keep on drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they did not want to hear like this isn't working. So another topic that you talked about that I also saw a lot was like government waste and like I mean specifically the crap money. Like it like was so parallel to our SERP money and like how it started and how it kind of like blew out of control and we had all this money to spend on all these projects that then we had two-story schoolhouses on the side of a hill where there's just mud huts all around. It just doesn't work. But so why was that a topic that you thought was important to address?
So there were two reasons I wanted to have the crap money, and the acronym for crap that and this is something I made up, although I think the acronym was pretty apt, was the Commander's Reconstruction Action Program, and it was kind of a a symbolic grab bag to represent a lot of things that happen in real life. Like you mentioned, the CERT money, which was the Commander's Emergency
Was
Reconstruction
the
Program, or
yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that. But anyway, I wanted to have some sort of program that represented all these different efforts to sort of buy our way out of the problem. And I hope that I succeed in accomplishing two goals in the novel. One was to sort of focus on the boondoggle dimension to this. So, like you mentioned, you'd have a schoolhouse somewhere and it's in a dangerous area, so it's not really doing anybody any good. Or you have a building somewhere, but it's not usable for whatever reason. Maybe there's sewage leaking through the floor. Maybe there's corruption going on with the partners who are helping us with the construction, or maybe there's sort of the more traditional contractors back here in the US overcharging. But whatever, there's just a lot of boondoggle stuff going on. And I wanted to highlight that. But then the other thing I wanted to get at in the novel was that there was this idea that if we just bought stuff, that would be a winning game plan, and that would result in victory. And unfortunately, that part never got looked at. So in the novel, you may recall that Nick accomplishes a lot as a newspaper reporter by uncovering the corruption, and he writes some stories that wins him a Pulitzer Prize, and he gets a couple of contractors and officials in trouble for their corruption, and they're lining their pockets. And obviously, if contractors and officials are lining their pockets with money, that is corrupt, and we want to crack down on it. And on the occasions when we do crack down on it, we should be glad. But the thing that frustrated Nick and the thing that frustrated me was that nobody ever said, "Hey, wait a minute. Even if you got rid of the corruption, this is just not a good idea. It's a dumb idea. You wouldn't make a bad child become a good child by showering them with gifts." But we still felt like if only we buy enough stuff and we buy it quickly enough, we can prop these people up, and then after a while they'll become reliable friends and they'll become strong. And that part never got looked at in real life. Nick gets frustrated in the novel, it never gets looked at. So even when we were able to sort of question what we're doing with all this money we're throwing around, we tended to just focus on the stuff where, hey, you violated a law, you took the money for your own gain, and we would crack down on that. But we wouldn't think about the bigger issue of this is not going to win the war. It's just going to drag it on.
Yeah. I think I felt the frustration and it like really resonated with me because we were trying to teach the Afghan people about like sustainment and like how to like maintain and sustain a building once it's built, but they had no idea. They were living in mud huts and we built these concrete structures and they were like they're going to last forever. They're concrete. And it's like no, you still have to do maintenance just like you do and like as a civil engineer, I'm not really trained to teach people about sustainment. I'm there to like help build the buildings. And so there was like this huge like disconnect in what was required because yeah, like we were giving them the stuff, but it wasn't the stuff they needed. And then trying to explain that to the higher ups, it never made it up past our level and we were just kind of stuck at the bottom with all the frustration. And so yeah, I was frustrated too.
Yeah, and I think I feel like that was a symptom of something that I hope I addressed in the book, which was that there would periodically be these manuals, and they would purport to tell you how to do counterinsurgency or stability operations or irregular warfare or whatever the term happened to be at the moment. And so what would happen though is that you would have these manuals telling people to do stuff like build a school or whatever, and it was there were a couple of problems. First of all, the people writing the manual were writing manual about something that human beings have never been very good at. Counterinsurgencies are usually pretty hard and they usually don't go well. So first you had to ask yourself, do the people who wrote this manual, do they even know what victory would require? And then the other thing was it was sort of this all-purpose nature to the manuals. It'd be a counterinsurgency. Here's the manual for counterinsurgency. And you're sitting there thinking, well, where? In Helmand province? Because that's different from Kandahar, or maybe in Iraq, or is it for Vietnam, or is it for Somalia? I mean, the idea that there would be a one-size-fits-all counterinsurgency manual, it's really kind of silly. But when you get a one-size-fits-all manual, then it would start to result in some of those problems you were describing and some of the ones that Annie experiences in the novel, which is you're told to do this thing, but it's very ill suited to the people you're doing it for.
Yeah, and I was just thinking when you said manual, they came out with a new manual. I can't remember what the acronym for it was, but it required that you had like so many different people. Like each civil engineer could only have so many projects. Well, we had 28 projects when we got in the country, and you couldn't just like close them all down. And so the way that commanders got around it is they got random people with no engineering expertise to get trained so that they could, be the person. And then me and the other civil engineer, we were still managing all the projects. So it was like they came up with this thing saying, oh, there's too many projects. These two people can't manage all this stuff. So we're going to, but then they had no way to like close out the projects that were there. And then you had the pressure to like start more projects, but we didn't even have, and so it was like we had this manual, but then out in the field, the manual was like, this makes no sense and we're out of regulation. So we have to get the security forces guy who has no idea what engineering to sign his name off on this project, which I mean isn't fair to that the person who's doing that because they have no real training, but they're the ones who have to sign off on it.
Yeah, that was a common problem. And again, I'm somebody who never deployed anywhere, but you would just keep hearing all this stuff and seeing all this stuff. And that was a problem I tried to capture with one scene in particular where Colonel Jones is sort of holding court on how to do counterinsurgency. And yeah, I think the problem that you described is one where we've bitten off more than we can chew. We got all these projects going on. We don't have enough people to do them. And in the episode in the book, he's got one of those hairball diagrams that you would see every so often, with all these different things that we need to do and all these different effects that we hope to achieve and all these lines and arrows showing the relationship between them all. And Annie's just sitting there suffering through this brief going, nobody can do all this stuff. And I just think that throughout the whole thing, we were biting off more than we can chew and refusing to admit that we had bitten off more than we could chew.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an important topic and not enough books are talking about like all those challenges. So I think that fiction is a great way to do it. Another topic that you covered is the role of women in combat before 2015, and I think that is something that is not talked about and definitely not known in the general population. So why was that something that you weaved into the story?
So, I mean, there were a couple of, reasons. One is that the way this story sort of unfolds, the key events were going to be in 2011, 2012 timeframe. So to a certain extent, the topic was dictating that time frame, but it did allow me to pull the string on some issues because you have Annie, who's a woman, and prior to 2015, women weren't allowed in combat roles, and there would be a lot of bureaucratic hostility towards movements to get women into combat roles. And then, even now that 2015 is behind us, you still wonder about what are the cultural obstacles that might be out there. And so having Annie be in a combat situation, I don't want to get into too much of a
Yeah.
spoiler, but having her be in a combat situation back at a time when that actually wasn't supposed to happen, things just sort of worked out that way. Let me kind of put a couple of ideas out there, I think, for readers to think about, which is, you know, if you need a clear head and you need to make the right decisions, don't you want somebody who's got a clear head and can make the right decisions? So there's that. Then there's the in the aftermath of Annie's episode in a combat situation, there's efforts by the bureaucracy to sort of kind of downplay it, maybe nitpick it, maybe keep it a little bit under wraps. And so I thought it was sort of interesting to see the way that you can officially say that you're addressing a situation when in fact you're kind of putting it on the back burner without looking like you're putting it on the back burner. And so those were definitely some things I wanted to put out there. And then I'd like to think that Annie is somebody that people would admire and respect. And I would hope that they would remind themselves that if there were a ban on women in combat, and there's not anymore, but if there were, what that means is that women aren't going to have one of the most important things that they need on their resume to get those positions like 3-star general, 4-star general. And so again, this comes back to the filters and the brain pool. If women can't have the resume that gets them into those positions where you affect strategy, advise presidents, advise the Secretary of Defense, then all of a sudden, again, you've limited your brain pool. So I do think that's something that's worth thinking about. I know a lot of times when people talk about women in combat, they kind of like to have a hyper tactical discussion where they talk about, can the woman carry the 50 caliber machine gun up the hill? Can she carry the tripod to the 50 caliber machine gun? Can she carry the mortar plate? But I would remind everybody, we're not losing all these wars that we've lost since World War II because we're losing battles. That's not what the problem is. We're losing the wars because somewhere along the line our ideas aren't very good. So you want to make sure that you've got qualified people that have the kinds of resumes they need so that you can get that bigger brain pool so that hopefully you have better strategies. Because I think bad strategies and bad ideas are what hurt us.
Yeah, I mean, even talking about the awards that you get from being in combat. When I interviewed someone years ago about her experience, she was a medic and she was on convoys in Iraq, but they wouldn't give her a combat action what is it, badge, army, because women couldn't have them, and so they were like, you're not supposed to be in combat. So even though you got shot at and the guy sitting on the same convoy you is getting that badge, you don't. And like that affected her career because, I mean, she had other problems like mental health and other issues, but like that was part of like what it was. And I was fortunate. I deployed with an infantry unit in 2010, and women couldn't be in infantry units, but I was attached to an infantry unit, and so that was somehow okay, even though I was on the same missions. And it's the same sort of thing. Like there, like a lot of people don't know those stories happen, and then they don't know the complexity of like how sometimes people weren't given a bronze star because they were a woman, and you're not supposed to be in combat, and all the complexities that go along with it.
Yeah, I think that's something you see a lot is that there's a checklist mentality. So people look at the checklist, you don't have a combat action badge, they're just going to say, okay, well, that box isn't checked. So we'll give it to the person who does have that, who does check that box. And there isn't a lot of the deep dive stuff on, okay, but you still were there and you still got shot at. That stuff tends to get glossed over. So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I think it's so important, especially like how it was downplayed in the book, like, and how I think stuff like that happened, and it's not a hard leap to say that some things like that may have happened in reality, even though this is fiction. I think that's why it's so good because you can start thinking about like, is that what? Because I had never thought about that, and then I was like, I wonder if something like that happened. And I recently posted about a Medal of Honor winner because there's only been one female, and it was during the Civil War, and someone said, "Well, so and so should have got a Medal of Honor, but hers got downgraded to a Silver Star, and this is why they believed what they believed." And I was like, "That's kind of an interesting way to look at it because it is kind of interesting that no women were given the Medal of Honor during these two conflicts when they had such pivotal roles."
Yeah, and you do see things like um, you get some issue, there's a big deal, everybody cares about it, and there start being all these studies on it. And then one thing leads to another, and there's multiple studies, and then people are sort of cherry picking the findings that support the views that they had all along before the studies came out. So that was kind of something I felt like I was getting at with that episode that Annie faced.
Yeah. Yeah, I read Fly Girls Revolt, and it's about combat exclusion for pilots to be lifted, and that the studies thing was something that came up
Yeah,
over. We need to do a study, and they're like, we were in Desert Storm. We don't need a study. We can just look at what happened in the
right.
war and see that we did it. And so it was really interesting to read her book and to see that similar type of thing of especially when combat exclusion. We need a study. It's like, no, there's a war happening. Women are already in combat. Let's just look at the data. We don't need a study.
Yeah, and that's something that it's fiction, so I made this stuff up, but something I wanted to kind of capture is that Colonel Jones, for the most part, is something of a villain and representative of some problems we would rather see fixed. But I do think that to get at this thing that you and I are talking about right now, I felt like that he had a little bit of a moment of redemption, because what you basically have is you have an infantry officer who one thing led to another, and he got put in charge of nation building, which is not what he should be doing. That's not what his background is. And I do think that his one golden moment in the book was when Annie distinguished herself in combat. He recognized that, because that's something he is really an expert on. People say he's an expert on counterinsurgency. He's really not, but he is an infantry officer. He understands the infantry, and she did what you expect from people in that type of situation. And again, like you said, we don't need a study. I saw it with my own two eyes, and Colonel Jones is saying, hey, this is good, and I think America ought to know about it. And he got really mad that there were efforts to sweep that under the rug.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a very redemptive moment, because at that point you didn't like him very much, and you were like, "Oh, good job, you did the right thing." Yeah, so that's really, yeah. I think it just covers so many good topics and so many things that people should be thinking about, and I mean, it's just, yeah, it's so great to be a fictional book and to be able to do that. So, what do you hope your readers walk away thinking about after they finish? I mean, there's so much.
So, I mean, there's a couple of things, and I certainly wouldn't say like bullet points, like you ought to remember this, this, and this. I do think that there's sort of questions and issues that you ought to have hanging around in your mind. I'd like to think, um, which is one, like we talked about, is um, why I think there's sort of a bias towards, if there's a problem and somebody comes up and they say they have a solution, there's a bias towards doing that thing. And so, like, there's a lot of slogans for that, like, don't give me problems, give me solutions. And it's only a problem if you have a solution for it. And I think that that was kind of the problem with Iraq and Afghanistan and in the novel, was that um, the people who would say, hey, I've got the solution, I wrote a manual, um, let's go ahead and do my thing, they were the people who got listened to. And again, Annie's the hero, and I hope that Nick is an admirable character as well. Even though I don't think he was the best boyfriend for Vicky, but that's a separate part of the story. But one thing I think you notice about Nick and Annie is that they identify lots of problems, and they identify them in a very articulate fashion. And I think this is something I hope people will remember. They don't have solutions for those problems. And I think that that's a very difficult thing to handle, is that, when you're a lance corporal or a first lieutenant, you got to take action. You got to get stuff done, and you can't sit there scratching your chin. I don't know where, but somewhere as you work your way up the chain, there comes a point where you need to be a thinker, and you need to say, okay, we've got a problem, but if I do a solution that's not actually a solution, I might make things worse. And at some point, that sobriety needs to come in there. And I think right now, we have a situation, it's not limited to the military. I think it happens in the corporate world or sports or wherever you want to look, is that people might understand the problem, but because they don't have a solution, the problem sort of gets wished away. So I guess that would be one thing, is that as you go through this saga with Nick and Annie, and you watch them describe pretty articulately what all these problems are, they don't have any solutions for them. And then, sort of a companion thing to that is, everybody always says that they like critical thinking. And you might recall that in the novel, Annie loses a year of her career to being put on this committee that's writing a manual for critical thinking. And I kind of imagine that as being something that we all ought to be laughing at. And there actually were things like that to manuals for critical thinking. I think the problem there is, we all know that critical thinking is good, but deep down, we kind of sort of hate it, because what it means is somebody might be telling you, hey, what you're doing is messed up. And you can't just tweak a few things and fix it. You're fundamentally wrong, and you're going to have to stop what you're doing and think of something different. Nobody likes to be told that. So I think that's something I hope people remember is we all talk a good game with critical thinking, but we have a tendency not to listen to it. And I kind of created this ironic situation where Annie is on this committee that's writing a manual for critical thinking, and her role is to be the red team on this committee. So she's supposed to do the critical thinking on the critical thinking manual. And all the guys in the critical thinking manual hate her because she's doing critical thinking on their critical thinking manual, and they just want to get the thing done and be done with it. So I know that I'm sort of making up a situation here, but I feel like that happens a lot. People say they like critical thinking until you start doing it to them, and then they tune you out. So I guess those would be things I would hope people would think about is don't just pay lip service to critical thinking, do it. And just because you don't have a solution doesn't mean that your description of the problem should be ignored. A problem's a problem, whether you can fix it or not.
That's so true. Yeah, and I think you can do that, use it in so many things in life. So I think that's so great. I really, if people don't know that I loved your book, I don't know what interview they're watching because I've said it multiple times. So if people want to find your book, where would be the best place to go? And I know I'm gonna have the link to your website and to Amazon in the show notes, but where can people go?
Yeah, so you can go to Amazon, and if you search for John Lawson III, Kurtz, it'll come up at the top of your search. You can do the same thing at barnesandnoble.com or same thing at bookshop.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much for writing this book, for being a guest on the podcast. I'm really glad we got to do this interview.
Thank you so much for your feedback. It really meant a lot to hear your encouragement.